My name is Detective Michael. Thompson and I have been working with the Phoenix Police Department for 17 years now. And in all those years, I have arrested drug dealers and gang members and violent criminals. But there is one case that breaks my heart every time I think about it, because it is not a story about a bad person doing bad things, but about a good person who was pushed into an impossible situation by poverty and desperation, and a healthcare system that values profit over human life. I met Rosa Martinez on a warm evening in September 2019 when we responded to a robbery call at a pharmacy on the south side of Phoenix. And when we arrived, the pharmacist was shaken, but unharmed, and he told us that a woman had threatened him with a knife and stolen insulin. And I remember thinking that was an unusual thing to steal, and most people rob pharmacies for painkillers or cash, not insulin. The pharmacist gave us a description of the woman and said she was Hispanic and maybe late 30s and small and thin and wearing a cleaning uniform. And she had been crying the whole time and kept saying, "My son is dying and I need insulin." And the pharmacist said he felt bad, but he had called the police anyway because a robbery is a robbery. We put out a description and checked the pharmacy's security footage and got a clear image of the woman's face and ran it through our system and found an address. And within an hour, we were at a rundown apartment complex in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Phoenix. And we knocked on the door of apartment 2B. A teenage boy answered, and he looked terrified when he saw us, and he said, "What is wrong, and did something happen to my mom?" And I said, "We need to speak with Rosa Martinez." And the boy said, "That is my mom, and what did she do?" And I said, "Is she here?" And he said, "Yes." And he called out, "Mom, and the police are here." Rosa came to the door, and she was exactly as the pharmacist had described, and small and thin and wearing a cleaning uniform. And when she saw us, her face crumpled. And she said, "I knew you would come, and I am sorry." And I did what I had to do, and she held out her wrists for the handcuffs. I said, "Mrs. Martinez, you are under arrest for armed robbery." And as I cuffed her, the teenage boy started crying and saying, "No, and please do not take my mom." And Rosa said, "David, it is okay, and I will be okay, and you be strong." And the boy said, "Mom, I need you." And Rosa said, "I know, baby, and I know." We brought Rosa to the station and processed her and read her rights and put her in an interrogation room. And I sat down across from her, and she looked exhausted and defeated. And I said, "Mrs. Martinez, do you want to tell me what happened tonight and why you robbed that pharmacy?" Rosa took a deep breath and said, "Detective, I know what I did was wrong, and I am not a criminal, and I have never done anything illegal in my life, but my son was dying, and I had no choice." And I said, "Tell me about your son." And Rosa started talking, and over the next 2 hours, she told me a story that made me angry at a system that could let this happen. Rosa Martinez had been born in Nogales, Mexico in 1981, and her family had crossed the border illegally when she was 10 years old, and they had settled in Phoenix. And Rosa had grown up poor but hardworking, and she had gotten her GED and worked various jobs and tried to build a life. When Rosa was 24, she had gotten married to a man named Carlos who worked in construction, and a year later they had a son named David. And for a few years life was okay, and they were poor but they were happy, and they had a small apartment, and both parents worked, and they provided for their son. But when David was 5 years old, Carlos was killed in a construction accident, and Rosa became a widow and a single mother, and she had to support herself and David on her own. And she took whatever work she could find, and she worked as a housekeeper and cleaned offices and restaurants, and she worked long hours for minimum wage. Rosa told me that when David was 9 years old, he started getting sick, and he was always thirsty and tired and losing weight, and she took him to a free clinic, and after tests, they told her David had type 1 diabetes, and it was serious, and he would need insulin injections for the rest of his life. The doctor explained that without insulin, David's body could not process sugar, and his blood sugar would spike, and he could go into diabetic ketoacidosis and fall into a coma and die, and David would need insulin every single day and probably multiple injections, and he would need to monitor his blood sugar. And Rosa asked how much the insulin cost. The doctor said with insurance it would be manageable, but without insurance, each vial of insulin costs around $300, and each vial lasts about 10 days, so Rosa would need to spend about $900 a month just on insulin. And Rosa felt her world collapsing because she only made about $1,200 a month. Rosa said she asked about getting insurance, but she did not qualify for Medicaid because she made slightly too much money and she could not afford private insurance because the premiums were too high and the clinic gave her information about assistance programs, but most had waiting lists or strict eligibility requirements. Rosa said she started working 2 jobs and she would clean houses from 4 in the morning until noon, and then she would work at a restaurant washing dishes from 6 at night until midnight, and she would come home exhausted and sleep for a few hours and then start over, and she did this 7 days a week. With 2 jobs, Rosa made about $1,800 a month, and after paying rent, which was $650 for a tiny 2-bedroom apartment, and after buying insulin, which was $900, she had about $250 left for food and utilities, and bus fare and everything else. Rosa said some months she had to choose between buying food and paying the electric bill, and she would skip meals so David could eat, and she would wash their clothes by hand to save money on the laundromat, and she would walk miles to save bus fare, and she did whatever it took to make sure David had his insulin. David grew up knowing how hard his mother worked, and he was a good kid, and he tried to help, and he would do chores, and he got good grades in school because he knew education was important, and Rosa told him, "You are going to go to college, and you are going to be a doctor, and you are going to have a better life than I had." But in September 2019, Rosa got sick, and she caught a bad flu, and she was coughing and feverish, and she could not work for 3 days, and when you work paycheck to paycheck, 3 days of missed work is devastating, and that month, Rosa came up short, and after paying rent, she did not have enough money for David's insulin. Rosa said she went to the pharmacy and begged the pharmacist to let her pay in installments, and she said, "My son will die without this medicine, and please, I will pay you back, I promise." And the pharmacist said he was sorry, but company policy required payment up front, and there was nothing he could do. Rosa left the pharmacy and went home, and David was there, and he had been rationing his insulin to make it last longer, and he was not feeling well, and his hands were shaking, and he was pale and sweating, and Rosa knew these were signs of high blood sugar, and David said, "Mom, I do not feel good," and Rosa said, "I know, baby, and I am going to fix this." Rosa said she spent the rest of that day trying to find the money, and she called everyone she knew and asked to borrow money, but everyone she knew was as poor as she was. And she went to churches and charities, but they said they could not help right away, and David's condition was getting worse. That evening, David collapsed, and Rosa caught him, and he was conscious but weak, and he said, "Mom, I am scared," and Rosa held him and said, "You are going to be okay, and I promise I will. Get your medicine," and she put David to bed and sat there, watching him and thinking about what she could do. Rosa told me that she made a decision that night, and she knew it was wrong, but she also knew her son would die if she did nothing, and she thought about all the years she had worked and sacrificed, and all the times she had gone hungry so David could eat, and all the nights she had cried because she could not give her son the life he deserved. Rosa said she waited until David fell asleep, and then she went to the kitchen, and she took a small paring knife that she used to cut vegetables, and she put it in her pocket, and she walked to the pharmacy, and she waited outside until closing time. When the pharmacist came out to lock up, Rosa approached him, and she said, "Please, sir, I need insulin for my son, and he is dying." And the pharmacist recognized her and said, "Ma'am, I already told you I cannot help you." Without payment, and Rosa pulled out the knife, and her hand was shaking, and she said, "I am so sorry, but I need that medicine." The pharmacist was frightened, and he opened the door and let Rosa inside, and she went to the insulin refrigerator and took 1 vial. Just 1, and she said, "I am sorry, I am so sorry," and she ran out, and the pharmacist called 911 immediately. Rosa went home and gave David his injection, and within an hour his color returned, and he felt better, and Rosa sat there watching him recover and thinking about what she had done, and she knew the police would come, and she was right because we showed up a few hours later. When Rosa finished her story, I sat there in silence because I did not know what to say, and legally Rosa had committed armed robbery and threatening someone with a knife. Even a small kitchen knife is a serious crime, but emotionally I understood why she had done it, and I thought about my own kids and what I would do if they needed medicine, and I could not afford it. I said, Mrs. Martinez, you understand that you are facing serious charges and armed robbery can carry a sentence of 3 to 7 years in prison, and Rosa nodded and said, I understand, detective. And I know what I did was wrong, but I would do it. Again, because my son is alive, and that is all that matters. I asked Rosa if she had a lawyer, and she said, no, I cannot afford one, and I will get a public defender. And I said, the district attorney will probably offer you a plea deal. And Rosa said, whatever they offer, I will take it because I am guilty, and I do not want to waste anyone's time with a trial. The case went to the district attorney's office, and the prosecutor was a young woman named Jennifer Chen, and when she reviewed the file, she called me and said, this is heartbreaking, and I do not want to prosecute this woman, but she threatened someone with a weapon, and I have to charge her. The media got hold of the story, and it became news, and the headlines were, Mother robs pharmacy to save dying, son and desperate. Mom faces prison for stealing insulin, and public opinion was overwhelmingly sympathetic, and people were outraged that Rosa had been put in this position. The pharmacist who had been robbed did an interview and said, I feel terrible about what happened, and I wish there was something I could have done to help, but I have to follow company policy, and I hope she does not go to prison. Rosa's public defender was a man named Thomas Wade, and he had been a public defender for 15 years, and he told me that this was one of the most clear-cut cases of desperation he had ever seen. And he said, I am going to argue that Rosa acted under duress and that she had no other option. The arraignment was held 2 weeks after Rosa's arrest, and David was there in the courtroom, and he looked terrified. And Rosa was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, and when David saw his mother in handcuffs, he started crying, and Rosa said, do not cry, baby, and everything will be okay. The judge read the charges and armed robbery and asked Rosa how she pleaded, and Thomas Wade stood and said, my client pleads guilty, Your Honor, but we asked the court to consider the extraordinary circumstances, and the judge said we will discuss circumstances at sentencing, and bail is set at $5,000. Rosa could not afford bail, so she stayed in jail, and David went to stay with Rosa's sister, Maria, and every day, David would ask when his mom was coming home, and Maria would say, soon, baby, and soon, and David started having nightmares, and his grades dropped, and he stopped eating properly. I visited Rosa in jail a few times because I wanted to check on her and see how she was holding up, and each time she asked about David, and I told her he was staying with her sister, and he was okay. And Rosa said, Detective, please make sure he has his insulin, and Maria knows how to give him his injections, and I said, I will make sure. Rosa said being in jail was terrible, not because of the conditions, but because she was separated from David, and she said he needs me. Detective, and he is only 14, and he has never been away from me, and what if something happens and I am not there? And I told her that her sister was taking good care of him. The weeks went by, and Rosa's case attracted more and more media attention, and advocacy groups got involved, and there were protests outside the courthouse with people holding signs saying healthcare is a human right and free Rosa Martinez, and the story went national, and people from all over the country were talking about it. A GoFundMe campaign was started to help Rosa pay for a lawyer and to help with David's medical expenses, and within days it raised over $50,000, and people were donating and leaving comments saying this woman is a hero, not a criminal, and the system failed her. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for November, and the courtroom was packed with supporters and media, and Rosa was brought in, and she looked thin and tired from her time in jail, and David was there with his Aunt Maria. And when Rosa saw him, she smiled and mouthed, I love you. The sentencing hearing began, and Thomas Wade stood up and addressed the judge, and he said, Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to call several witnesses who can speak to Rosa Martinez's character and the circumstances that led to her actions, and the judge agreed and said, proceed. The first witness was David, and he was nervous and shaking as he took the stand, and Thomas asked him to tell the court about his mother. And David said, my mom is the best person I know, and she works 2 jobs to take care of me, and she never complains, and she always makes sure I have my medicine even when it means she does not eat. David said, when I was diagnosed with diabetes, my mom promised me that I would be okay and that she would always make sure I had my insulin, and she kept that promise, And David started crying and said, I do not want my mom to go to prison, and she only did what she did because I was dying, and it is my fault she is here. Thomas asked David about the night Rosa was arrested, and David said I was feeling really sick, and my mom had been trying to get my medicine for days, but she did not have the money, and I could tell she was scared. And when she came home that night, with the insulin, I felt better right away, and then the police came and took her. David looked at the judge and said, Your Honor, please do not send my mom to prison, and I need her, and she is not a criminal, and she is a good mom who was trying to save me. And the judge said, Thank you, David, and you can step down. The next witness was Maria, Rosa's sister, and she testified that Rosa had always been hardworking and honest, and that she had struggled for years to provide for David. And Maria said Rosa would go without food and without basic necessities to make sure David had what he needed, and she sacrificed everything for her son. Maria also said that since Rosa had been in jail, David had been having nightmares, and his health had declined, and he missed his mother terribly. And Maria said, Your Honor, this family has suffered enough, and please show mercy. Several of Rosa's employers testified, and they all said she was reliable and trustworthy and hardworking, and one woman said Rosa cleaned my house for 5 years, and I trusted her completely, and she never took anything. And she is the most honest person I know, and what she did was out of desperation, not criminality. Then Thomas called me to the stand, and I testified about my investigation and about interviewing Rosa and about what she had told me, and the prosecutor objected and said this is hearsay. But the judge allowed it and said I want to hear what the detective has to say. I told the court that in my 17 years as a police officer I had interviewed hundreds of criminals, and I could usually tell when someone was lying or making excuses, and I said Rosa Martinez was not making excuses, and she took full responsibility for her actions, and she knew what she did was wrong, but she also knew her son would die if she did nothing. I said I have children of my own, and I cannot say with certainty that I would not have done the same thing in her position, and the prosecutor objected again and said the detective's personal feelings are irrelevant, but I continued and said, what is relevant is that our healthcare system failed this woman and failed her son. The prosecutor, Jennifer Chen, then presented her case, and she said, Your Honor, I want to make it clear that I have sympathy for Mrs. Martinez, and I understand why she did what she did, but we cannot ignore the fact that she committed armed robbery and she threatened another person with a weapon, and there must be consequences. Jennifer said, if we excuse criminal behavior because someone has a sympathetic story, then we undermine the rule of law, and what Mrs. Martinez should have done was seek help through legal channels, and there are programs and charities that help people who cannot afford medicine. Thomas Wade stood up and said, Your Honor, the prosecutor says there are programs that help people, but Mrs. Martinez tried those programs, and they all had waiting lists, or she did not qualify, and her son did not have time to wait, and he was dying. Thomas continued and said, This is not a case of someone who committed a crime for personal gain or out of malice, and this is a case of a mother who was forced to choose between watching her son die and breaking the law, and she chose her son, and any parent in this courtroom would have done the same. Finally, the judge asked Rosa if she wanted to make a statement, and Rosa stood up and she was crying, and she said, Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong, and I am not trying to make excuses, and I threatened a man who was just doing his job, and I scared him, and I am sorry for that. Rosa said, But I am also a mother, and my son is my whole world, and I have worked 2 jobs for 10 years to take care of him, and I have gone hungry so he could eat, and I have sacrificed everything to make sure he has his medicine, and that night when he collapsed, I thought I was going to lose him. Rosa said, I tried everything legal, and I went to the pharmacy and begged, and I called charities, and I asked everyone I knew for help, and nobody could help me, and my son was dying. And Rosa looked at the judge and said, What would you have done if it was your child? The judge was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, Mrs. Martinez, I am going to be honest with you, and this is one of the most difficult cases I have ever presided over, because the law is clear but justice is complicated. The judge said you committed armed robbery, and that is a serious crime, and you threatened someone with a weapon and created fear, and you took something that did not belong to you, and under normal circumstances you would be facing years in prison. But the judge continued and said these are not normal circumstances, and you were not acting out of greed or malice, but out of desperation and love for your child, and I have read the letters of support, and I have heard the testimony, and I believe you are a good person who made a bad choice because you felt you had no other option. The judge said, I am going to sentence you to 2 years of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service, and you will have a criminal record, but you will not go to prison. And the courtroom erupted in applause, and people were cheering, and Rosa collapsed in tears. David ran to his mother, and they hugged, and Rosa said, baby, I am coming home, and I am so sorry. And David said, you have nothing to be sorry for, Mama, and you saved my life. And Rosa held her son and cried, and I had to look away because I was getting emotional myself. The judge banged her gavel and said, order. And I also want to say something else. And she looked at Rosa and said, Mrs. Martinez, what happened to you should never happen to anyone in this country, and no parent should have to choose between their child's life and breaking the law. The judge said, I am ordering the court to connect you with social services and to help you find programs that will provide your son with the insulin he needs, and I am also going to write a letter to the state legislature about this case because something needs to change. After the hearing, Rosa was released, and she and David went home, and over the next few weeks, several things happened that changed their lives. And first, the GoFundMe campaign ended up raising over $50,000, and the money was put into a trust for David's medical expenses and education. A local health clinic reached out and offered to provide David with free insulin and medical care, and they said they had a program for uninsured patients, and they wished they had known about Rosa's situation sooner. And Rosa broke down crying when she heard this. Several pharmaceutical companies were embarrassed by the media attention, and they started programs to provide free or reduced-cost insulin to people who could not afford it, and advocacy groups used Rosa's case as an example of why healthcare reform was needed. Rosa completed her 200 hours of community service, and she volunteered at a clinic that helped uninsured families navigate the healthcare system, and she would tell her story and help other mothers who were struggling, and she turned her pain into purpose. David thrived, and his health stabilized. Now that he had consistent access to insulin, and his grades improved, and he started talking about wanting to become a doctor so he could help people like his mother, and Rosa encouraged him and said, you can be anything you want to be. I stayed in touch with Rosa and David over the years, and I would check in on them occasionally and see how they were doing, and Rosa always thanked me for being kind to her during the worst time of her life, and I told her I was just doing my job. 3 years after her conviction, Rosa completed her probation, and her record showed that she had complied with all requirements and had no other legal issues, and she continued working her cleaning jobs, and David continued excelling in school. David is now 17 years old, and he is at the top of his class, and he has been accepted to several colleges with scholarships, and he wants to study medicine and eventually become a doctor who works with underserved communities, and he says he wants to help people like his mother. Rosa is 41 now, and she still works hard, but she is not working 2 jobs anymore, and David's insulin is covered through the clinic program, and Rosa has been able to save a little money, and sometimes she can afford small luxuries, and she says it feels like a miracle. Rosa told me once that she does not regret what she did, and she said, Detective, I know it was wrong, and I know I broke the law, but my son is alive and healthy, and that is all that matters. And if I had to do it again, I would make the same choice. This case changed how I think about crime and punishment and about the difference between legality and morality, and Rosa Martinez committed a crime, but she is not a criminal, and she is a mother who loved her son more than she feared the consequences. I think about all the other families out there who are struggling to afford medicine and who are making impossible choices between paying rent and buying insulin, and between feeding their children and filling prescriptions. And I think about how many Rosa Martinezes are out there who are one emergency away from having to break the law. This case also taught me about the power of community and about how people came together to support Rosa and her son, and the GoFundMe campaign and the letters of support and the protests outside the courthouse showed that people understood that Rosa was not the villain in this story. The real villain is a healthcare system that allows life-saving medication to be priced so high that working families cannot afford it, and a system that forces mothers to choose between watching their children die and committing crimes, and a system that values profit over human life. Rosa's case got national attention, but there are thousands of stories like hers that never make the news, and there are parents who are rationing insulin and skipping doses and going into debt trying to keep their children alive, and many of them are not as lucky as Rosa. I think about the pharmacist who was robbed and how he felt terrible about the whole situation and how he was just following company policy, and I think about how that policy prioritizes payment over saving lives and how that is wrong on every level. Since Rosa's case, there have been some changes, and some pharmaceutical companies have created assistance programs, and some states have passed laws limiting insulin prices, but there is still so much work to be done, and people are still struggling and dying because they cannot afford medicine. I visited Rosa and David last month, and David showed me his acceptance letters to college, and Rosa was so proud, and she said, "Detective, my son is going to be a doctor, and he is going to help people, and all those years of struggle were worth it." And I said, "Rosa, you should be proud, and you raised an amazing young man." David said, "Detective, I want to thank you for treating my mom with respect when you arrested her, and a lot of people treated her like a criminal, but you saw that she was just a scared mother trying to save her son, and that meant a lot to us." I told David that his mother was one of the bravest people I had ever met, and that what she did took courage, and David said she is my hero, and when I am a doctor, I am going to make sure that no other kid has to watch their parent go through what my mom went through. Rosa said her biggest regret is not that she robbed the pharmacy, but that she scared the pharmacist, and she said he was a nice man who was just doing his job, and I wish I could apologize to him properly. And actually, the pharmacist later said in an interview that he forgave Rosa and that he hoped she and her son were doing well. This case will stay with me for the rest of my career because it showed me that justice is not always about following the letter of the law, but about understanding context and circumstances and human desperation. And Rosa Martinez deserved compassion, not condemnation. If you are watching this, I want you to think about the Rosa Martinezes in your community, and think about the people who are struggling to afford medicine and rent and food. And think about how one medical emergency could destroy a family financially, and think about how we can change the system so no parent ever has to make the choice Rosa made. Thank you for listening to this story, and if it moved you, I encourage you to advocate for healthcare reform and to support programs that help families afford medicine, and to show compassion to people who are struggling, because sometimes good people do bad things for reasons we cannot judge unless we have walked in their shoes.